Hello, everyone. I'm super excited to welcome our guest today at Books and Culture, Taynara Leszczynski, who's joining us today. She's a book lover, a PhD candidate in literary studies, and an expert on detective fiction and Sherlock Holmes. Thank you so much, Taynara, for being with us here today.
You're welcome. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about crime fiction. I have been a reader for a long time. I remember I was kind of 12 when I started reading Agatha Christie's books.
Wow,
And
so
then,
you started well.
yeah, I fell in love with Agatha Christie first. Then I met Conan Doyle.
Oh, so first you started with Agatha Christie and then you discovered Conan Doyle.
Yes, usually I believe it is the opposite because Sherlock Holmes is more famous than Agatha Christie and her detectives like Poirot and Miss Marple. But with me, it was the opposite.
I have to say that I'm not sure how I began reading detective fiction or which one was the first book that I read. But I remember my grandfather had a collection of Agatha Christie books.
Oh
And
my God, that's amazing.
yes, unfortunately, after he passed away, I don't know what happened to the books. But I remember being fascinated by those titles and those volumes. So I was also introduced to Agatha Christie first, although I only read her later on in my life.
Oh, that's really nice. And actually, I really like to read books in old editions, like your grandpa. I would love it. Than in new ones because I believe that the old editions have kind of a mystery atmosphere.
Yes, I love connecting with other book lovers through old editions, especially annotated editions of books.
Yeah, yeah, and someone taking notes about who is the murderer, who
Oh,
is
yes.
the yeah, I love it.
Nice. So, Taina, I think you've already introduced yourself a bit, but would you like maybe to tell us a little bit about your literary journey so far and how you first became interested in detective fiction, academically speaking, perhaps?
Well, actually, I just got into the literature universe in the field of studies because of crime fiction. Because I was a reader of crime fiction. And when I was 12, I found a book of Agatha Christie in the library of my school. I was in elementary school. And then after that, I started to read more and more, not only crime fiction, but especially it. And then when I have to decide which college I would go, the course especially, I decided to study literature. So I went to the university and I did a lot of research on it. Then I went to the master, and my dissertation was about crime fiction, a Brazilian book. Um, and then now I'm almost finishing my PhD thesis. I'm very happy about that because it's a long journey. And it's also about crime fiction. Now I'm comparing a Brazilian book of short stories that are based on real crimes, true crimes. They happen here in Brazil, in some Brazilian capitals like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Curitiba. And then I am comparing it to In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. That is a very famous book of true crime. Actually, it's kind of the father of true crime. Of course, we had many books before it, but it is from this one that we have this name, true crime in literature. It's like the biggest one. So
Mhm.
I'm comparing the practice, um, the structure, the ideas, how they develop it, and so on. And of course, I read a lot of books of crime fiction just for pleasure, not only for studies now. And that's it.
I can imagine. That's such an interesting journey. And I wonder, do you think there is a big difference between, for instance, Brazilian crime fiction and American or English crime fiction?
Yeah, I don't know why, but I think Brazilian crime fiction has more violence
Okay.
than mystery. So this is kind of a big difference. If you see stories by Rubem Fonseca, Luiz Alfredo Garcia Rosa, that were authors very important to Brazilian crime fiction, the stories are full of violence because of the big cities like São Paulo, a lot of urbanization, modernization, and of course, because of the time. So we are living this time, this age. And when you talk about the crime fiction from England, United States, we are talking about a time that we didn't have uh, too much technology. So detectives didn't have another way to solve the mysteries. They needed to think about it. So it's kind of different because of time, I believe, most.
That's really interesting. And I am already writing down some recommendation of authors to explore Brazilian crime fiction. So later we can also share some titles for those who are interested. And let's talk about Sherlock Holmes then, our
Yeah.
crime fiction celebrity. How did you first come across Sherlock Holmes stories?
Well, I kind of couldn't say actually the first time that I heard his name, because I believe Sherlock Holmes is very famous, that a lot of people think that he really existed like a real person.
Wow,
And
yeah.
his name is kind of very famous here in Brazil, even though people uh, never really read something by Conan Doyle. People don't know who Conan Doyle is. People know who Sherlock Holmes is. So the creature is bigger than the creator. It's kind of pretty interesting to think about that in literature. And I remember that I started to read Sherlock Holmes by the short stories. And I didn't like at the very first time that I read it, because it was very different from Agatha Christie's stories. And I
Mhm.
was thinking at that moment that I was a beginner reader at the beginning of my journey, that crime fiction was one thing. And then I found out that it was a lot of things. And then I started to read more about Sherlock Holmes. And then I found this book. I have the Brazilian edition, but the name in English is The Hound of Baskerville. And
Mhm.
then I fell in love with Sherlock Holmes because of this book, and also I fell in love with Watson, because in this book, Watson has more power. He appears actually sometimes more than Sherlock Holmes. So I really like it. And I remember at the beginning of this book, I was like, oh my God, is this a horror book? But people said to me that it was crime fiction, because it is kind of scary at the beginning, but it is awesome. And of course, there is no monster from another dimension, something supernatural. There is a explanation at the end. Of course, it's not a spoiler, people, because in crime fiction we know that we cannot have something supernatural. And I fell in love with Sherlock Holmes from this book. And after this book, I read, of course, I studied in Scarlet.
Mhm.
I have the Brazilian edition here. And I didn't like it a lot at the beginning, because it is kind of, how can I say it? It has more details. It
Mhm.
has two plots actually, and that is the first time you read the first plot, and then it starts a second one, and you are like, "What is happening here?" But at the end, it all makes sense. So I really like it before when I read it. it again.
Nice. You mentioned that Sherlock Holmes has become greater than its creator. It reminds me of Frankenstein as well, right? Everyone knows who Frankenstein.
Sure.
I mean, some people confuse Frankenstein and the creature, but everyone knows the story of Frankenstein, although not everyone knows who Mary Shelley was, right?
Yes, and it's kind of funny because I remember when I was teaching at the university, I got the subject about the British literature, and you had to study Frankenstein. And I asked it to my students before we read the story, what they think about Frankenstein. And we did a kind of word cloud, you know, a word cloud like where everybody says one word about the topic, Frankenstein. And it was kind of funny because a lot of people said green because they think that the creature was green. And then they talk about the electricity because they thought that the Frankenstein was the creature of Frankenstein was made of electricity, a lot of parts of body, then like a chalk.
Yeah.
And it was really funny because it is kind of a gossip that a lot of people talk about it, and nobody really reads that.
Yeah, also the movie adaptations that add different interpretations and different images. For instance, the electricity, right, or the color green. It's not in the book, but in some adaptations of the novel, it is in fact what happens. So what do you think about Sherlock Holmes? Sherlock Holmes has also been adapted into several media, not only movies, but also TV series and video games. So how do you think that adds to the legend of Sherlock Holmes?
Yes, I believe that movies help a lot. This figure becomes like more famous than the creator. But I also believe that there is one other thing in the stories of Sherlock Holmes. Like there are a lot of mysteries, and people want to read that to find out the mystery resolution before the detective. And they many times they can't do it, so the detective is like, oh my god, so smart, he could find the solution for the mystery and I could not. So people read the stories, and they started to admire this figure because Sherlock Holmes could find out the solution. I believe that could be a reason.
Yeah, it is very intriguing. Do you think this then is one of the reasons why Sherlock Holmes stories are so popular? Because the reader can engage with the mystery and has a more active part than in reading other types of stories, perhaps.
Yes, because it kind of get into the curiosity of the readers. And many people actually believe that Conan Doyle at that time could solve some mysteries, because if he wrote a lot of mysteries like that, and he brought a lot of good solutions, and that was funny because people use it to write letters to Conan Doyle, to Agatha Christie, asking for help to solve a lot of personal mysteries because of their detective.
Oh, I didn't know about that. That's so interesting.
Yeah. And do you know that there was one time that Agatha Christie got missed for about 10 days, 11 days, if I'm not wrong. And Conan Doyle actually tried to solve the mystery.
Oh, so
Conan
they
Doyle tried,
actually
yeah, because like that, it is a gossip, okay?
okay, literary
So
gossip, love it.
yeah. So Agatha Christie's husband had a new lover, and he wanted a divorce, and he told Agatha Christie, and she got a little scared, surprised because of it, of course, because at that time divorce was something really hard for women.
Mhm.
So she just disappeared for about 10 days. And then she was found in a hotel. She kind of lost her memory about these days. And during this time, Conan Doyle, with other writers, tried to find out what happened, like a detective. And Conan Doyle took, I can't remember what it was, but Conan Doyle took something from Agatha Christie, and he brought it to his kind of group when they tried to do contact with supernatural things to find out where Agatha Christie was.
Oh,
So I
yeah.
love this story because it's really surprising.
Could they find her? Could they solve
Yeah,
the
but of
mystery?
course, not because of this.
Yeah, I read that for a time in his life, Conan Doyle was really interested in the occult and in the supernatural. Um, did that affect his stories later on in his career?
I believe he couldn't write something about that in Sherlock Holmes stories because what he is the difference between crime fiction and horror books is the supernatural thing stuff. So of course we can have in crime fiction this allusion, something really seems supernatural from another universe, but it can't be confirmed. It can't be real at the end of the story. So, like in the Hound of Baskerville, for example, we have this kind of thing that at the beginning people think it's kind of a ghost or maybe something like that. But at the end, we have an explanation for all the weird stuff that happened. And so I believe he couldn't really write it in Sherlock Holmes stories.
Otherwise, it would end up in another literary genre, right? It would not
Yeah.
be crime fiction, and perhaps would disappoint his readers.
Some readers, yes. Because of course, as a reader, we want to be surprised, but not too much.
Oh, that's a good one. Yes.
Yeah, and we want to have these kind of chains to solve the mystery. And if there is the supernatural element, we couldn't.
That's beyond our human capabilities of solving. Yeah, that makes sense. That's very interesting. And I believe, I don't know how many Sherlock Holmes stories Arthur Conan Doyle wrote, but many. So I'm sure he became a dear character, and some people even confused him for someone real, like you know that person. So if you change the literary genre in which he appears, that could cause indeed a lot of confusion.
Yeah, that's right, indeed. And actually, Conan Doyle was a doctor at the beginning of his career. He was not a writer, right? And that's really interesting because he didn't earn a lot of money as a doctor. So he decided to be a writer. And I don't know in Netherlands, but here in Brazil, that's something really surprising because it's totally the opposite. And
Yeah.
actually, at the end, it helped him a lot because Watson was also a doctor, so he could use his knowledge about medicine and so on Watson, and actually on Sherlock Holmes too, because Sherlock Holmes can bring a lot of explanation to us based on science.
Mm-hmm. So he combined his two passions, right? I notice a lot of medical language and medical vocabulary in the story. So it comes from his education as a doctor.
Yeah, I believe so. And actually, at the end of his career, he was not very happy with Sherlock Holmes anymore because Sherlock Holmes was bigger than anything that he could write. So if he started to write another kind of stories, people wouldn't read and people would say, oh no, come back, Sherlock Holmes. Write more about Sherlock Holmes. And when he killed Sherlock Holmes in the story, people were very angry at him. It was kind of crazy.
So that's a good story to tell. Can you say something about why he decided to kill the character and what happened afterwards?
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about Conan Doyle because the author that I can say it's my favorite one is Agatha Christie. But from what I know, Conan Doyle wanted at that time write something about the historic novels and so
Mhm.
on, epic novels. He was very influenced. He used to read a lot of Walter Scott,
Oh, nice.
and he couldn't write another thing because the readers want more and more about Sherlock Holmes. So he decided to kill Sherlock Holmes. So he couldn't write more about him as he was dead. That's his idea at the time. But people didn't like it. People started to write many letters to him, a lot of complaints, and he decided to bring Sherlock Holmes back.
So he came back from the dead, or how does it go? How does Sherlock Holmes come back to life?
Oh, actually, I read the short story a long time ago, but I believe the name of the short story was The Empty House.
Mhm.
It is in a book called the. I have this edition that it's called The Return of Sherlock Holmes,
Okay.
but I'm not sure about the name of the first edition because
Mhm.
the coming back was in a short story. The
Okay.
Empty House, if I'm not wrong. And then, of course, people love it. It was like, oh my God. And actually, the same thing, not the same thing, but something very similar happened to another detective that was very famous too. That was Hercule Poirot by Agatha Christie. Because when he died in a book called, I can't remember the name, but it was something about curtains, the title of the book. uh, there was a notice, a news actually, sorry, in the newspaper about his death in the New Yorker.
As if he were
It,
a real person.
yes, in the pages of the obituary
Uh-huh.
where the news of real people
Uh-huh.
were posted. So it was really funny.
Oh, wow. Yes, Hercule Poirot is another example of I would perhaps not as large scale as Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle. Um, so maybe let's talk about other interesting detectives in literature. So you mentioned Hercule Poirot from Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes. Are there any other stories with detectives that you would recommend?
Yeah, sure. I believe we could say that the stories by Edgar Allan Poe are very important for crime fiction. Edgar Allan Poe wrote only three crime fiction stories, but we can say that he was the father of the crime fiction
Mm-hmm.
because he wrote the first literary detective that was Dupin.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, here in the first book that Sherlock Holmes appeared, I studied in Scarlet, Dupin is mentioned because Watson says that Sherlock Holmes uh, is very similar to Dupin. And
Ah.
Sherlock Holmes didn't like it.
Oh, he didn't like the comparison.
Yeah, he didn't like it. He said something like, oh, no. I am very different because Dupa is very primitive. He used
Mm.
this word primitive
And he's very
to
modern.
refer to Dupa. Yeah, he's very modern. But of course, I believe that this mention was something very smart because if Conan Doyle didn't mention Dupa here, probably people would say that it was a copy. Of course, Sherlock Holmes and Dupin are very different. It's not a cop. He was
Mhm.
influenced, he was inspired, but it is not a cop. But we know people would say, people would
Yeah.
comment about it.
So in a way,
So Conan
Arthur
Doyle
Conan
was
Doyle,
very smart.
Yes, he anticipates this comparison already and makes the character himself say, no, I'm not like him. So don't even try comparing me to this other
Yeah.
previous detective. Nice.
Yeah. That's really nice. And actually, Conan Doyle said in another interviews that of course, he read Edgar Allan Poe, and that's okay, but he didn't copy.
No, literature is always a dialogue, right? You cannot write in in an empty space. There is baggage as a reader, as a writer, and it's really nice to connect all these links, right? Agatha Christie, Edgar Allan Poe, Arthur Conan Doyle. Any other names of authors that should be considered when talking about detective fiction?
Well, when you talk about crime fiction, we have many different kind of stories. We have like the traditional ones, like Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, and we have kind of contemporary writers. And we could say that Truman Capote is a very important author, writer of this time, especially because he brought to literature a new kind of genre, we could say, true crime. So when people started to this kind of true crime stories, they didn't stop anymore. So we have a lot of true crime stories nowadays.
Yeah, who was it that, well, I guess many writers say that and work with reality. Reality is more interesting than than what our imagination can create. So combining the two is, I guess, a recipe for success.
Yeah, and actually here we have an example that even though in literature we have this word, the father, this expression actually, the father of the genre, it's not the real, because like we say that Truman Capote is the father of true crime in literature, but actually Edgar Allan Poe had wrote the story, the mystery. I can't remember if it was the mystery of Marie Roget or the murder of Marie Roget now. But he wrote this story based on a real crime that happened there in New York, if I'm not wrong. But in the story, it happened in France, to get this distance from the reality, so people wouldn't related both cases.
Yeah, and in a study in Scarlet, so I've been reading the story, and Sherlock Holmes himself, the character, refers to all these crime stories from. He even says, I think Watson calls him a book of the history of crime, because he knows so many examples of real life crimes. I don't know if those really happened in real life. But it's part of Sherlock Holmes' own repertoire.
Yeah, I'm just gonna close my window because
Yeah,
there is a
sure.
noise coming. Just 1 minute.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's better. And here I have my dog.
Hello.
Can you guess her name? Her name is Agatha Christie.
Oh, wow. I was gonna ask if it had something to do with crime fiction, and it does.
Yes. It's
Oh,
kind of
awesome.
funny because she looks like a lot Snoopy,
Yes.
from Charlie Brown cartoon.
Cute.
Yeah.
So, Taynara, I was gonna ask if I mean, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote so many stories. For someone starting in the world of Sherlock Holmes, what would you recommend they read first? Of what stories you think are really nice for someone just getting started to read?
So I would say that we have two kinds of readers. Mainly, of course, we have more, but mainly two kinds. That kind of reader that wants to start from the beginning. So to them, I would say they study Scarlet, of course, because it is the first book that Sherlock Holmes appears. and where he met Watson, and they started to work together, to live together. So to understand the beginning, how it started. But there are other kind of reader that wants to read only the best book from the author and to read another authors, not only one. So I would say The Hound of Baskerville. It's really nice, really interesting. One of my favorite crime fiction books, not only from Conan Doyle, by Conan Doyle, but in general.
Oh, so that's a must read. And my other question, perhaps you've already answered, but what is your favorite
Oh,
or Sherlock Holmes story? I guess that's the one. But what about crime fiction in general? What's your favorite story?
so I kind of have two favorite books, both of them by Agatha Christie. So, the number one, I would say that is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So we have a plot twist here. Oh my God, a big plot twist. So it is a really great book. And then the first book that I read by Agatha Christie was this one. I believe its name in English is And Then There Were None.
That's a good one, yes.
So yeah, we have a difference between these two books. This one is more like detective fiction. We have Poirot here and so on. And this one is kind of more mysterious, you know. We don't have a detective here. We have a lot of people, not a lot, I believe it was like 10 people that went to an island, a very isolated island, and crimes started there, started to happen there. And so they needed to find out who is the murderer. And there is a horror atmosphere at the beginning, so it is really interesting. So I really like both of them. But there is another book by Agatha Christie that I would also recommend because it was her favorite. So we know that Agatha Christie wrote about 80 novels.
Wow, amazing,
And
right?
actually, she also wrote poetry.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So I found out it when I went to the city where she lived from a long time for a long time, Wallingford in England, and I was at the museum. And at the museum there is a gallery only to Agatha Christie's stuff, and there was a first edition book of her poetry, and I was very surprised.
I'm also surprised. I'm going to take a look at what she wrote in poetry.
Yeah, actually, here at this book we have a poetry, but it's not by her. It's adapted, but we can say from this that she liked poetry, and then I found out that she wrote it, and it was really nice. But there is another book that it's called. The title is The Cricket House, I believe, in English.
I think that's the first Agatha Christie book I've read.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, so you started from a good book.
I was very young, so I don't think I had the maturity to really grasp the story. So I would definitely like to revisit that story.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. And the reader will be so surprised by the end.
Yeah, I don't remember the story, but I remember the feeling when I read it and the feeling of being really surprised. Yeah,
Yeah,
coming
I was
back to me
like,
now.
I closed the book and I was like, no.
Those are the best books. You may forget
Yeah,
the plot, but you don't forget the impression. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. The feeling, something that we couldn't say, explain. And there is a really great move with the same title,
Oh,
based on the book, that it's also very good. It's
okay.
good like the book.
I'll check it out. And you said you talked about Agatha Christie's favorite book. Do you
This
know
one.
this one? And do
Yeah.
you know if Arthur Conan Doyle had a favorite story?
I don't know, but
Let's see.
I would like to know it. I'm gonna look for it.
Or maybe he never admitted to having a favorite.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Taynara, for this talk. It was really insightful, very rich. And is there something else you would like to say to our readers at Books and Culture?
Well, I would say that nowadays we have still a kind of prejudice to books in about crime fiction, but it's not true that stories about it they are not superficial. As many other genres, we have good books and we have bad books. So just start to read it. You're gonna love it, and that's it.
Get involved. Yes, I
Yeah.
agree with you completely. I don't like this sort of literary prejudice, highbrow, lowbrow, popular, not popular. I believe in good stories, and there are definitely good stories in
Yeah, that's
detective
right.
fiction. So I'm going to also share with you guys the details, so you can follow Taynara on Instagram and also check out her website and her courses. And thanks again for joining us, Taynara. Taynara.
Thank you. Bye.